In 1860, the year of the election arrives, and Northern Democrats who feel that the Southern Democrats are too committed to protecting slavery at whatever cost. And many Northern Democrats actually want to keep slavery out of the West. They split from the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party splits into at least 3 different parties. What this means is that Lincoln, the Republican candidate for president, who supports a platform of stopping the expansion of slavery into the West, this platform, which has been greatly politicized and made even more of an issue by the Dred Scott decision, by the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Now, Abraham Lincoln wants to reverse the Dred Scott decision, and his platform is to keep slavery out of the West. Doesn't say anything about abolishing slavery in the South, but Southerners are so committed to expanding not only slaveholders' quote-unquote rights to property, meaning enslaved people, but they also want to see slavery expand into the West. There's a number of reasons for this, not least of which is that Southerners fear that if poor white Southerners don't have the opportunity to own slaves, then they will become dissatisfied with the planter aristocracy which runs the South. And in fact, planters had tried to reopen the African slave trade in 1857 because they wanted to see the price of enslaved African Americans drop so that humble whites in the South could more easily purchase enslaved Africans and set themselves up on plantations. The effort failed, but it did underline the fact that certain planters in the South feared that poor whites would not support them if war came with the North. They were actually wrong about that, we'll see. But in any case, Abraham Lincoln runs on the Republican ticket. The Republicans had only run one candidate. They ran a candidate in 1956, John Wilmot, who actually did really well. John Fremont, I meant to say, who actually did really well in the 1856 election, considering there had been no Republican Party merely 4 years before. In 1860, the Republicans realized that if they can capture some of the border states, Illinois, Ohio, then maybe they could win the election. That's why they choose Abraham Lincoln. Not only is he a great orator and, made famous by his debates with Stephen Douglas in Illinois for the Senate, to become the senator for Illinois, a contest which ultimately Stephen Douglas won, but it got Lincoln's name out there. All right. And in 1860, when Lincoln runs for the presidency, he's a well-known name, and Southerners despise him. Now, explicitly, Abraham Lincoln, on his platform, only promises to keep slavery out of the territory won from Mexico in the U.S.-Mexico War. But Southerners, of course, fear that he won't stop there. They want to see slavery expand, and there is fear that ultimately he or the Republican Party would try and abridge quote-unquote slaveholder rights in the South. So Lincoln is elected largely because the Democrats are divided, but Lincoln won the most electoral votes, even without carrying a single Southern state. He won the most popular votes as well because he won the North, which was far more populated than the South. So it was a fair election. Lincoln handily defeated his opposition. And if all of the opponent factions had come together, they probably still would not have been enough to defeat Lincoln. Nevertheless, when Lincoln wins, the southern states most committed to slaveholding, the so-called Deep South, including South Carolina, Georgia, Mississippi, Alabama, and Texas, they secede. They leave the United States and form a Confederate States of America, an imagined nation, a newly imagined nation, newly created nation, with its capital in Montgomery, Alabama. Now the issue is more about secession than slavery. Are states allowed to leave the Union? Lincoln resolutely says, no, they are not. And what happens is that the flashpoint is at Fort Sumter. Now, Fort Sumter is a federal fort, meaning it belongs to the federal national government located in Washington, D.C., but it's off of Charleston Harbor in South Carolina. Lincoln orders that Major Anderson's garrison stationed at Fort Sumter, this is the federal U.S. Army, they stay there and they don't go anywhere, even though South Carolina has told federal officers to vacate all federal all federal property located in the geographical boundaries of South Carolina. The troops at Fort Sumter in the port of Charleston refuse to abandon their post. This is the impasse they reach. And ultimately what happens at Fort Sumter is that Major Anderson's men start to run out of food. Lincoln sends a ship to Fort Sumter to try and reprovision the men under Major Anderson so that they don't starve and they can hold on. He also fills it with guns, but they weren't supposed to know that. But what ends up happening is that when this boat sails into Charleston Harbor to try and reprovision Fort Sumter, South Carolina orders the firing on Fort Sumter and the bombardment of Fort Sumter. Fort Sumter is surrendered to the Confederates. The federal garrison leaves. But Fort Sumter is an important event, not just because it's the first major confrontation of this war, the Civil War. It's also important because it convinces the Upper South, Virginia, Arkansas, North Carolina, and Tennessee to join the Confederacy. Why? Because they thought that Southern states had a right to secede. And when Lincoln would not remove the troops from Fort Sumter, and when he even reprovisioned them, they thought that that was an antagonistic stance taken by the federal government that did not recognize the right of South Carolina and the other Deep South states to secede. Of course, Lincoln did not recognize that they had the right to secede. Lincoln was first and foremost a Unionist who wanted to preserve the unity of the country. But in the Upper South, Virginia, Arkansas, North Carolina, Tennessee, they see this as an aggressive act of federal overreach. And they say, since they believe that the Deep South had the right to secede from the Union, they also were going to go ahead and secede, precisely because they believed that Lincoln had acted tyrannically and used the power of the federal government in an unconstitutional way to force the Deep South to stay in the Union. So Fort Sumter precipitates the secession of the Northern South, the Upper South, Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas. But there were still some states that had slavery that did not join the South, including Kentucky, Missouri, Maryland, Delaware. Maryland was really important, right? Because the federal capital, Washington, D.C., is located between Maryland and Virginia. Had Maryland seceded and joined the South, Washington, D.C., the national capital, would have been located in the Confederacy, right? So it was really important to hold on to Maryland. Lincoln thought it was very important to hold on to Kentucky and Missouri as well because they offered strategic access to major river systems. Missouri and Kentucky, since they were slave states that ultimately did not secede, what ends up happening is that the soldiers in those states who wanted to protect slavery, they just went over to the southern side and fought alongside the Confederacy. In the case of Missouri, about 100,000 whites fought for the South, whereas 55,000 whites and 45,000 blacks in Missouri actually fought for the North. Lincoln then orders a blockade of the southern ports, and the Civil War has begun in earnest. And in order to prevent other border states that had slavery from seceding and joining the Upper South and the Deep South in their secession from the United States, Lincoln suspends habeas corpus and ends up arresting, unconstitutionally to be totally honest about it, anybody who he thought was behind conspiracies to try and get the border states to secede from the Union. But in any case, we've seen that there were a number of events: the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the Dred Scott decision, John Brown's raid, which precipitated the coming of the Civil War. Fort Sumter, which followed directly after the election of Lincoln, it becomes clear that this is a conflict that can no longer be resolved through politics and will instead be resolved through violence.